Hello, I'm Lisa White, Director of Education at the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California at Berkeley. I'm also chair of the AGU Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this plenary session, Toxic Ivory Towers and Conversations with Underrepresented Voices. In this session, we'll feature filmmaker and author, Professor Kendall Moore, to discuss her insightful and award-winning work and film series, Can We Talk? Difficult Conversations with Underrepresented People of Color. Professor Moore's work explores the issue of social belonging in the context of STEM careers and the effect it has on the lives of people of color who are pursuing an education or career in STEM, or who have decided to leave because of an overwhelming feeling of not belonging. Her opening address will be followed by a panel to feature Professor Ruth Enid Zambrana, University of Maryland, author of Toxic Ivory Towers, and Dr. Brandon Jones, Program Director, Education and Broadening Participation Programs in the Geosciences Directorate at the National Science Foundation, and Professor Vernon Morris, Director, School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences, Arizona State University, and co-leader, Geoscientists of Color, Call to Action. Dr. Moore comes to us from the University of Rhode Island, where she has been a member of the faculty since 2003. Prior to her faculty appointment at the University of Rhode Island, she worked as a television journalist focusing on medical, health, race, and environmental issues, and she is the recipient of numerous grants and awards for her work, including 2 Fulbright Scholar Awards. Welcome, Professor Moore.
Greetings, everyone. Hello to the AGU conference community of 2020. My name is Kendall Moore. I'm a professor at the University of Rhode Island in the Department of Journalism. I'm also a documentary filmmaker, thus some of you may recognize me from my documentary series called Can We Talk?, which explores the issue of sense of belonging in STEM. Today's discussion will be about toxicity in the academy, and I want to say that I'm not an expert on the topic like Dr. Ruth Zambrana, the author of the book Toxic Ivory Towers, The Consequences of Work Stress on Underrepresented Minority Faculty is. And she, along with my colleagues, Drs. Lisa White, Brandon Jones, and Vernon Morris, will join me as I facilitate a panel and a community discussion on this very topic following this talk. The lens that I do bring to this topic is that of a journalist, an observer of experiences of underrepresented people of color. And as a Black female in the academy, I've been on Planet Academia for 18 years now and have made it to full. And one of the things that I've observed is that the academy is imperfect, and perhaps it has been that way since the time of Plato. There are few institutional structures with such clearly delineated spaces between us and them. With this, there seems to be rites of passage throughout, and at the end of undergrad, graduate school, then after assistant professor, and so on, along with celebration also came some suggestion that my permanent inclusion in the department was not something always thought of as possible. For example, a department letter supporting my tenure read, "When we hired her, we really didn't know how she was going to fit in. It has always been my labor as someone considered as an outsider to make them see me as someone who fits in." Most underrepresented people of color in academia will likely be able to share a similar story. My first year on the tenure track, I was completely overwhelmed. I went to my doctor convinced that death was nigh, and she said, "Nope, you're just a first-year professor. You'll be fine." That was coupled with years of not only me trying to create a sense of professional home, but also seeing my colleagues of color go through the same experiences of unwelcome, only to be told it's the price you have to pay to be on Planet Academia. And that price has been quite high, actually. In all disciplines, but especially the sciences, a range of violences from micro to physical has cost STEM significant losses. For racialized others in particular, Micro and macroaggressions, such as mispronouncing names, stating that someone was admitted into a program not based on merit but due to affirmative action. You got that because you are a minority. That award isn't important, and the list goes on and on. That behavior signals to those of us who are already navigating the particular and peculiar system of apartheid as maybe this isn't the place for me. It is such a huge problem that in 2019, the STEM Opportunities Act of 2019 legislation was proposed to combat the hemorrhaging of underrepresented people of color from STEM. The legislation argues outmoded structures and gender bias play a significant role in the problem. For students, some of those outmoded structures include not teaching inclusively, an unwillingness to meet students where they are, preferring to transfer them into different disciplines because, quote, they can't do the math or the science. For grad students, the inequities are multiple. They include many of the same for undergrads, but add to that the fact that many of our grad students engage in work of equity and inclusion because their institutions have chosen not to. These grad students are literally trying to create space for themselves, others who have been marginalized, and for the next generations that are to come. Their PIs, major professors, and advisors often overlook this important work, even discourage it. If these grad students of color go on to academia, not only will there be all kinds of who are you and how did you get here, many will choose to engage in equity and inclusion with little to no support whatsoever. If this will not be valued as an important part of your tenure or promotion package, why do it? We do it because, like my ancestors, we are fighting against that same element, the one that seems hell-bent on our erasure. In Can We Talk, we discover that these stories are not rare or unusual and occur at every level of academia. Let me share a clip from the film with you now.
I don't know that the sciences will ever be more welcoming.
But there's undeniable privilege that comes with being white.
I haven't always felt included or embraced.
I taught them to say they're an indigenous scientist.
The documentary Picture a Scientist explores the issue of sexism and sexual harassment in STEM.
We certainly didn't want to be seen as troublemakers.
People said, what happens in the field stays in the field. It was bullying from day one.
Harassment and sexual harassment has been characterized as, quote, an epidemic in higher education globally. Bondestam and Lundqvist point to, quote, precarious working conditions, hierarchical organizations, a normalization of gender-based violence, toxic academic masculinities, a culture of silence, and a lack of academic leadership as all key features enabling sexual harassment. Dr. Terrell Morton recently gave his excellent presentation, but is it really just science? In the presentation, he does an excellent job laying out the tenets of anti-racism theory in the context of STEM, but a central plot point is about toxicity. He shows an image of a dead fish and says, if you see a dead fish, you think, what happened to that fish? And then if you see a lake full of dead fish, you will begin to wonder, what's wrong with the lake? Dr. Brandon Jones of NSF also makes this point with his Your Water is Nasty piece in his presentation on John Henryism. It's no secret that Black, Latino, Latina, and Latinxes and Indigenous scholars experience academic spaces differently than our white counterparts. Most of us are marked by violent histories, by white supremacy and colonization, and by the patterns and structures that continue to define the United States as a place of eternal divisions. We bring the lived lives of our ancestors to work, whether it's seen or not, And when we experience white supremacy, that truth is awakened in our DNA every time. When we witness the murder of a Black man, the brutal treatment of refugees, and the total disregard of Indigenous lives on tribal land during COVID, it's a reminder of what we know on a cellular level. The remarkable disregard for Black and brown lives without consequence is upheld time and time again. When white supremacy is on full display, as Henrika McCoy points out, on the steps of the Michigan State House and all over the United States, it awakens in us a sense of terror. What I don't want you to think is, oh, that's just the streets. The Ivory Tower has been the originator of much of that white supremacy and the philosophy and logic behind having no consequences with regard to others. Let me explain. In the United States, the Academy as we know it today was born of the Enlightenment and of global colonial expansion. Many of the colleges and universities were literally built by slaves and endowed by the slave trade and named after slave traders on indigenous land. Then add to the equation that these institutions gave rise to both Western science and pseudoscience alike. The pseudoscience, which established race and racial hierarchy that is part of our everyday landscape today, has no grounding in biology whatsoever. That hierarchy of the races placed Black people at the very bottom and Indigenous people just above Black people. The early founders of the scientific disciplines and organizations, such as Galton, Agassiz, Morton, Breckinridge, and Muir, to name a few, they were all laying the groundwork of racism we see today. This all the while snatching up Indigenous land in the act of establishing land-grant institutions. Please see this website. The authors of the site give us, especially those of us working at land-grant institutions, the truth about how the land was acquired. The mission is to, quote, untangle the powerful and painful strains of myth and money behind the land-grant university system which broaden access to higher education in the United States. My next film will explore just some of these themes.
To me, the culture of STEM and the practice of STEM is very much intertwined with white settler colonialism.
A slow realization of mine was that the science itself, in its very construction, was built through the process of colonization.
That at its root, it's coming out of a very problematic system.
I think science has always existed.
Never acknowledges that there is non-Western information.
What happened and how we built up to what we are today is kind of just ignored.
The practice of our inquisition into nature and the way the world works and the why we're here and all of the scientific questions have been codified in a way post-Enlightenment that there is a way of doing science that is colonized.
And the way we practice is fully influenced by that Enlightenment era sort of scientific method that emerged in Europe.
We really need to reckon with all of the injustice that's occurred.
I think we have to reshape how we think about the past and how we think about the scientific process.
My late mother grew up in segregated Baltimore, graduated top of her class, was offered full scholarships to elite colleges. This was in the 50s, just after schools were becoming desegregated. She went on to be one of the first African Americans to graduate from the University of Maryland and eventually got her PhD in organizational psychology. She was a pioneer in the field and easily one of the smartest people I have ever known. One of the things that still aches inside me, though, is that we shared so much of the same types of traumas at the hands of our respective academic institutions, one generation apart. For my entire academic career, she sat by my side year after year, held my hand, and let me talk through all of those life-altering experiences that I had, from assistant professor all the way up to the day I became a full professor. Did they assume you were less intelligent than them? She would ask. Yes, Mom. Did they let you know in no uncertain terms that you did not belong there? Yes, Mom. Did they nearly convince you that academic life wasn't for you? Yes, Mom. But despite it all, did you stay at it? And did you try and make equity possible for others on the inside? Yes, Mom. A fraught sense of belonging has always been part of my lived experience, and although my mother protected me from all of the excruciating details of her own painful lived experiences, I always knew there were many that were the same. And when I sat down to do my first interview for Can We Talk, Part 1, my 19-year-old student, Jossie Alexander, who could have been my own son, proceeded to tell me they assumed that I was less intelligent than them, confirming that our work is in not letting another generation go harmed. My mother passed away the summer I made Can We Talk. If she were still here, she would be able to see how we have been able to bring those stories across the country to universities, colleges, and other institutions to start deep conversations about a sense of belonging in the context of a global reckoning about race. And on this day, she's also missing the fact that a multiracial woman has been elected Vice President of the United States of America. We are so hopeful because look at what we have and can achieve. Yes, there is darkness, but don't dismiss our successes. My mom, as a pioneer in the field of organizational psychology, brought language, framework, dreaded assessments, and philosophy to the workplace and the academy. She was an excellent facilitator and mediator. I hope to be headed there too one day. I got her history and I got many of her gifts, and I, like so many of my Black and Brown colleagues in the academy, they too got their history and their intent to make things right from what and who came before them. We're seeing a new day with global change afoot. Institutions such as Brown, Emory, Rice, Georgetown, and UPenn, just to name a few, reckoning with their own slave pasts, we find ourselves in the middle of what could be the greatest paradigm shift we have ever seen. This work is essential to us staying here, and you need us. Citing Zambrana, it is widely known, but perhaps not accepted, that diverse college faculty play an integral role in advancing new knowledge and fostering pluralistic perspectives among students who will advance equity in a diverse and global society. The toxicity, that yucky water in the metaphor, by Morton and Jones. Zambrana says that, quote, the high turnover and attrition among URM faculty undercuts the, quote, proactive work that universities are doing to diversify faculty ranks. So for us to move forward in the best interest of our diverse others, the next generation, the academy, and for science and society in general, we need to take a hard look at ourselves. We need to have the hardest of conversations with a willingness to not look away, so that we can fully understand what we have done to our own. How are we going to dismantle the seemingly intractable features of the past? Those answers will only come after you start to do the work of trying to understand the past. We have so much work to do as for Brown and Black folks, because our existence on this land in the Western Hemisphere is etched by the darkness of colonization, slavery, and terror, and characterized by the constant threat of impermanence. We will always fight to be here with an aggravatingly obsessive movement towards permanence. I applaud the work and the ethical processes of the work that many of you are doing. Whatever you are doing or not doing, becomes not only inherited by, but the heritages of those to come next. Thus, justice work should be viewed as a necessary act of resistance as well as survival.
You're on now, Kendall.
I am? Okay. Great. Well, welcome to our session on Toxic Ivory Towers. My name is Kendall Moore. If you just watched that piece, you know who I am. And I would love to introduce you to my team of panelists, my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Lisa White from the University of Berkeley, Dr. Ruth Zambrana from the University of Maryland, Dr. Brandon Jones from NSF, and Dr. Vernon Morris. Today we're going to talk about toxicity in ivory towers. But first I want to say a couple of things that this is going to probably be a sensitive conversation, and I want to let anyone know that if you are feeling triggered, to please contact me directly. I'm here to support you. And if you would like to take that conversation offline afterwards, I would love to be there to support you. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that I'm coming to you from the state of Rhode Island on Narragansett land. I also produced the 3 films that address these issues on sense of belonging also on Narragansett land. So thank you to my Narragansett family here. I'd also like to say thank you to Billy Williams, who invited me to be here today and to set this conversation up. I'm so proud of AGU and the work that they are doing around diversity and inclusion. And add to that team, of course, is Dr. Pranoti Asher, who I'm also collaborating with on another discussion around ethical place-based research. So please tune into that event next Friday at, I believe, 11 o'clock, but you have to double check the calendar. Start this conversation with a little bit of a setup because it's such a broad conversation and there are so many different entry points. So I'm going to set this up and then I'm going to throw the question over to Dr. Zambrana. And when I throw you a question, colleagues, can you first give us a brief introduction and tell us a little bit about your work and your research, and then respond to my interrogation. So what I want to say briefly is that talking about the ivory tower can be discussed in a multitude of ways. And I'm going to leave it up to my panelists to explain how they're entering into the conversation. But I do want to say that the conversation can happen on the substructural level, so the origins of academia and how that is historically problematic. And I got into that a little bit with my plenary introducing the conversation on the Enlightenment era science, colonization, and so forth. Then we can talk about the infrastructure of the academy, right? How it was built, what informed it. So the substructure and then the infrastructure. And then on top of that, we can talk about the superstructure and how it's all interconnected globally. So all of us are working on different levels and have different entry points, but all of us can talk about the systemic problems, because these different layers of structure inform the culture, they inform the norms, they inform the ethics. So some of us spend a lot of our time in that specific place only. So each individual on this panel comes at this very differently. So you can pick your entry point, way of thinking, to understand that we're not all working, in the same location in this particular conversation. So having done that little bit of framing, I do want to now ask the question of Dr. Zambrana. First, introduce yourself, and then tell me a little bit about your research and your book, Toxic Ivory Towers. You are an expert in this subject, and as I said in my plenary, I am not. I am a journalist, and so I am very interested to hear from you about your research and also where you enter into this conversation on toxicity in academia.
Good morning, esteemed colleagues and AGU audience. I guess I should start. I am a Puerto Rican from New York City. And I think I entered as a person who had very few opportunities in this society to start with. My parents did not speak the language, did not have education, had third grade education. And yet I was at different points in my life given the opportunity of access to resources, beginning with the nun who was across the street in the 5th grade, to the white male mentors that I have had, 4 of them, who opened doors for me and who allowed me to see what I could do with health and equity in my life. For that reason, I have always been committed to those groups that I grew up with. In high school, there was 1 African American. In college, there were 2 African Americans, et cetera, et cetera. I never met a Mexican American, Mexican origin, or an indigenous American until I was in my late adulthood. So my goal was really to open the doors for people like me, low-income Puerto Rican, Mexican American, Native American, and African American students. The book, the origins of the book, and I want to say I concentrate on these people, on these 4 groups, because of their unique historical incorporation. And I think when we use large terms like people of color and diversity, my work has really been on individuals who were historically incorporated because their land was taken away, because they were brought here involuntarily, both African origins and Puerto Ricans, and or their land was removed, like Native Americans and Mexican Americans. And that historical incorporation marks these groups distinctly and marginalizes them distinctly from other groups. And I think one thing that was really clear to me is that these groups have been denied the American dream. And the American dream is hailed as the reason to come to the United States by immigrants. But we are still fighting for the American dream, which is the opening of social and economic opportunity structure. So the book started, I'm a medical sociologist and public health scientist, and in 1999, I observed at the University of Maryland, 2 relatively young African-American women died, 42 of breast cancer, 56 of diabetes. Based on my own knowledge that good education, good health go together, I said, what's happening here? What's happening here? I started asking URM faculty all over the country, do you know of a relation between work and health? And my goodness, believe it or not, people start saying, oh yes, so-and-so died, they were 40, so-and-so died, they were 38, so-and-so is 40 and she has diabetes. So it was clear the premature mortality and the comorbid conditions were affecting us disproportionately. And I want to know why. So if all the factors that I had learned that really worked well were not there, what was happening? It had to be the institutional climate. So I started this process and I interviewed 60 URM. My work strictly defines these groups because I am convinced. I have been in the academy 42 years. I am convinced and I know that many of these experiences that Professor Moore, who knows a lot about this, talked about, occur, and that narrative is told only by certain groups of people, because everyone is experiencing different types of discrimination. But the unique, chronic, historic, unprecedented lack of fit, low intelligence narrative applies predominantly 95% to historically underrepresented. So that's what I wanted to know, Professor Moore. I think I've answered. What are the forces that have continued to make people not complete, leave the academy, or get sick and have to retire early or actually die? I think there are two key societal forces. One is the stereotypes of low intelligence, the closure, the bad mentoring we get that oftentimes derails our careers, the constant use of us, of the diversity that is not. So we have become these institutional mascots, I call in my book, that we represent diversity. And the benefit of our work is only for the institution and not for us. This is called taxation. We are constantly taxed. Racial battle fatigue, constantly. Professor Moore has experienced it, the lack of fit. We don't fit. Why don't we fit? Because we have a slightly different point of view. So that's a big one, the stereotypic impressions of our lack of fit, our lack of intelligence. The other one is the code switching and the play on words like diversity. Diversity has no measurement, has no accountability, doesn't mean anything to anybody. It means different things to everybody. And it has really served as a strong social force of exclusion of URMs and the inclusion of whatever is defined as people of color. So I think my book is trying to raise the consciousness. I have been so pleased that in the last 10 years, we have really seen an explosion of literature and writing that Professor Moore has talked about. So the issue has finally come out. What is distressing, I cannot be as optimistic as Professor Moore, is that no one is reading this. White folks and other folks are not reading this. We know this. So how do we get to the allyship? We cannot do this alone. There are not enough of us. The data show all of STEM, computer science, biological science, physical science, it's less than 5% African American, about 5 to 7% Latino, less than 1% indigenous, and we can't do it alone. So we have to stop reading our own stuff. Someone else has to read it. We need allies, and I think we need allies, and I hope we can talk about that today. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to come back to that question, and I actually see a question in the chat that we will get to. I want to announce that we are going to have an overflow conversation after this session, so we'll take a break for 15 minutes because I think folks have a lot to say and have lots of questions. So we've created a lot of space and time. So keep the questions coming. My next question is, first I just want to comment about this phrase, racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue. So I want to move on now to Dr. Vernon Morris, who was at Howard University and HBCU for a long time. And I want to talk about how like spaces compare to spaces where we are feeling our difference acutely. So the difference between HBCUs and PWI, so predominantly white institutions, is it just about race? So if we take race as a factor out of the toxicity, which, you know, I'm kind of being coy here because I know, and hopefully you'll explain it. Is that just what it is? Is that the only factor? So I'm throwing it to you. Please introduce yourself. You are now at, for folks who want to track you down, at Arizona State, but you can talk a little bit about what you're now doing there. Dr. Morris.
Thank you, Kendall. I guess I'll say a little bit about myself. I identify at least as a Black geoscientist.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
It's a little bit low.
Okay.
Do you want to play around with that, Vernon? And I'll come back to you. Oh, that's worse. Okay. How about here, Vernon? You work on that, and I'm gonna move over to Dr. Jones, if that's okay. So, Dr. Jones, you are a marine scientist who works at NSF, and you've been an administrator for a long time. Before that, you were at the EPA. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the federal role and how feds are actually sometimes, and the Fed structure is somewhat complicit in the toxicity of academia in a multitude of ways. But there's one very specific way I want to talk about, which is the structure of NSF. One example is the separation of the human experience from the scientific research, and how I see that as problematic, because when you look at, you know, indigenous science, for example, it's all interwoven. So why at the federal level do we separate these things out, and how is that complicating the issue, and how is it being addressed, or is it being addressed?
Yeah, that's a heavy question, and but you're hitting at some points that get to what you said in your opening clip, and even what Ruth shared. It goes back to the history of the country and who was having a say in designing all the systems that make up the country, including the academic systems here, even from, 300-400 years ago with Harvard on up till now. And so, and then that includes how the federal government was designed. And so what we see in the science agencies throughout the federal government is that NSF and NIH are seen as the foundational science organizations of the discovery science, the basic research. And then there are all of these mission agencies, I'll call them mission agencies, that are science agencies, like NOAA, like NASA, like EPA, agriculture, energy, etc. And so, and I heard Vernon say this, I don't know, some time ago, that what we're seeing in the separation of the sciences and the directorates at NSF, or the separation of the agencies by their scientific mission and disciplines, is a reflection of what you just talked about, the distillation of science from a holistic perspective down into these very specific disciplines. So it's for indigenous people, for Hispanic or Black, African American, whose history and culture come from a place of holistic observation and integration, to try to fit into an area where there's, everything is distilled down to this specific discipline, and we'll study this little tiny thing and then try to plug it back into, the big picture, versus looking at everything integrated. And I think we call that one of the attempts at NSF, I'll close with this now, is this convergence push. So the technology, the community, the research, and all these things come together to help us solve problems. Well, people of color have been on the planet doing this for thousands and thousands of years. So there is a bit of a mismatch there.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, I have acknowledged that there's an audio problem. I don't think that we are not in control of that. I think the engineers are working on that. I think that it's getting a little bit better. So I'm going to move on. Vernon, how's your audio doing?
Test 1, 2, 3. Is it better?
It's still a little bit low. So, yeah, it's low. I can hear you, but it's low. So I'm going to move on. As we're trying to still work on it, I'm going to move over to Dr. Lisa White, if that's okay. So Dr. Lisa White is a professor, well, was a professor, but currently working at the Museum of Paleontology at the University of Berkeley. So welcome. Lisa, tell us about your work and working at the museum.
Well, thank you, Kendall. Can you hear me okay? Are you able to hear me fine?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I'm always so inspired by your work, and a little bit about my background. So I've been the Director of Education and Outreach at the Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley for the last 8 years. And so in that role, I'm expanding the suite of our online resources. We've primarily interacted with the public through many of our popular websites, but I've carried over from San Francisco State University, where I was a faculty member for 22 years, many elements of the diversity and inclusion programs that I directed in support of both pre-college students and also undergraduates of color that are interested in pursuing careers and majors in the geosciences. It's worth mentioning, though, I'm actually a second generation academic. So my parents met at San Francisco State University, and my late father was later a faculty member at San Francisco State and eventually faculty. He was a professor of psychology at University of California at Irvine. So although I never aspired to be a faculty member, when I discovered geoscience and paleontology, I was actually well into my graduate career and perfectly happy to try to focus more on research. But when an opportunity came to be a faculty member at my alma mater at San Francisco State, I welcomed the opportunity. But I realize now that I'm at Berkeley, I was in such a bubble at San Francisco State, university I was already very familiar with, even though my relationships changed with the faculty there. After all, they were my professors and mentors and then became my peers. But I always had a sense and was generally supported at doing a range of programs that focused on diversity in geoscience and broadening participation. So that was always part of my portfolio. But my experience as a faculty member and then later as an administrator, I was associate dean of the graduate division for several years at San Francisco State, then associate dean of the College of Science and Engineering. It wasn't without stress and doubt and feeling like an imposter even at my home institution. But as I know, the other panelists have shared or will, we sort of just motor through it all because, we're dedicated to what it is that we do. But now in the role that I have at the Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley, spending a lot of time, mentoring graduate students about their career paths, I encourage them to think about the kind of career that they want. And there are careers at academic institutions that aren't members of the faculty, as in the position I have now, but it's still, there are many, many ways to share your science. And so I just encourage us to continue to think about, what are the kinds of places and units and, work situations that are the most healthy for professionals of color, to do their science.
Okay, I'm being told that everyone needs to mute your phone so that we're minimizing feedback. And yeah, also mute yourself in the side panel. Great. Vernon, are you able to get your audio working? Because we're eager to hear from you. Still no? Okay. Not yet. No.
Thank you. You will now be placed into conference. Your conference
okay.
is being...
He's calling in. Still a little bit lower.
You have to mute your phone.
Yep, mute your phone.
If you hear me now, I'll just push ahead if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Audio. So thanks, Kendall, and hopefully we can work through we'll work through this. I'm sure that we will. As Kendall said, I have spent a lot of years at HBCU, probably about 24 years of my education and career at HBCU, historically Black colleges or universities. But I've also spent about 10 years at predominantly white institutions and 2 years at international institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether or not there's toxicity in the university is an interesting question. And let me say a little bit about my career, and then I'll come back to that expertise. I find that as a Black geoscientist or atmospheric scientist, I do enter into this with some privilege. I enter with male privilege, and I can see that. Actually, it's pronounced at HBCU, but I can see it also throughout the community and in predominantly white institutions as well. But I also, because of my physical embodiment, am at the margins of field sciences as a Black male. Certainly as one who has taken on in his career priority to educate other Black and brown students, to create opportunities for them, not just opportunities educationally, but career opportunities, to speak out about that and to broaden the networks, which are so critical for getting into career opportunities and professional opportunities. And so I think it's interesting to turn to your question, whether or not if you take race out of the equation, would all things be better? So I've been a professor in Africa, for example, at University in the Philippines, at De La Salle University, Philippines. The structure of the university, the power hierarchies themselves, have racialized elements embedded in them, even at HBCU. A lot of your STEM faculty at HBCUs are not African American, and a lot of your faculty have come from those same institutions where the power structures, the hierarchies, the systems of assessment, all of these things have racialized elements, and we bring that with us to HBCUs or MSI. We bring that with us to whatever institution. And so while HBCUs have
hire African American faculty in the sciences. There are departments that have never hired a black woman, or in 2020 have one black woman or no black woman on the faculty, have never elevated into full professor on the faculty. And these are not racialized, at least visibly on the surface, if you say, well, race is out of the equation. I would argue that race is never out of the equation. In fact, I don't know if I'm frozen out or not, but I'd argue that because racism requires transformational change, it's difficult to enact that change if we're not fundamentally changing structures, modes of assessment, policies, and hierarchies in the academy. So I do not hear anything, so I'm not sure. I'll pause there to see if technically we can make sure that we're connected or not.
Okay, and if to the panelists, if you're not in the conversation, would you please mute yourselves? So this is from Jessica. I'm a white early career, whoops, sorry. I just got kicked off the platform, sorry. I don't know what's going on here. I'm not the engineer. I'm a white early career, can't really see it. But her question is, how can you be a better mentor to students who are coming from communities of color? Yeah, so I get this question often and a lot. Introduction to how to be a better mentor. My immediate response is, first you have to have a conversation where you're mostly listening. And sometimes mentors believe that they have all the answers without fully understanding the needs of the individual. So you need to sit and have lengthy conversations with your students to understand what their needs are, who they are, where they come from, to do your best to try to understand. So that requires a great deal of patience and collapsing of the hierarchy too, right? Because that individual is giving you a great deal, right? They're giving you a lot of labor in sharing their story. A lot of the experiences are trauma informed. So the fact that they're even coming to you and sharing their lives, and also perhaps looking for a certain kind of support is work in a variety of ways. So you have to understand that there's a lot going on there. And it's not met with a great deal of welcome when the immediate response is, well, let me fix this. I have solutions. You can't have an immediate solution to decades and generations and sometimes centuries long informed issues. So the first thing you really need to learn how to do is to really listen to us and appreciate and respect where we're coming from. And then be willing to share of yourself, because all of us come from somewhere. We all have histories, and many of our experiences are also trauma informed. Not that you want to share all of your challenging life experiences with your students, but we're all human. And the structure is designed to suggest that professors are impervious to challenges, that we are in fact superior to others, when in fact we know that that's not true. So it's an opportunity to collapse those hierarchies, to listen to one another, and to share your vulnerabilities, and to work on a very human level. And that's some very basic, everyday stuff. You don't need a book to figure that one out. But that's my 2 cents, my 25 cents, I'm sorry. Anybody else want to jump in with a comment on how to support Jessica in her work to be a better mentor?
Can she see me?
Ruth, yes. Ruth, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh my God. Okay. Hello? Can you hear me now? No.
Yep, you're on.
Okay. I think what you're saying, Professor Morrison, is absolutely correct. But I do think that, first of all, we have to distinguish when you say people of color who we're talking about. So the history of African Americans is different from the history of Puerto Ricans, from Mexican Americans, from the indigenous. What we value each of these groups, what our past experiences have been. And people who want to mentor us do have to listen, but they also have to read and understand and know the history of those groups and some of their lived experiences. So I really think that's important. I was at UCLA. I had Chinese and Japanese students who I knew nothing about, and I read about their cultures. I read about what it was to be a Japanese woman in that society. So I think that's number one. Number two, there has to be compassion. There has to be an understanding that no, we are not all equal. We are in a democracy, but it's a very unequal democracy, and that we have had challenges and don't have the resources that other people have. You know, I had a friend the other day tell me, why don't you just pay the neighbor $5,000 to cut down a tree? I mean, I don't have $5,000 extra. You know, it's like we need to know that we are different, and that we have a wealth gap, we have a resource gap, we've had negative experiences. I think compassion is also. I think caring and connection. In other words, one of the most important things we can do in the mentoring experience is provide connection to grants and advocate for those individuals to be co-principal investigators. Talk to your colleagues and say they should be co-author. So it is both material as well as spiritual, as well as emotional support. And then you have foreign born, I mean, you know, young Asian women, Chinese women, they need different types of supports. So I think there are two levels. One is, who are you talking to? You have to know who you're talking to. You have to know what their experiences are. You have to know what they need. Not all URM need all of it. So I think that's important. And you have to care. And you have to connect. Mentoring is work. And I think, you know, that's really, really important. In my work, there were 3 examples I was going to give. You know, either the mentor tells the person, well, why don't you go mentor the URM students? Well, they haven't been mentored yet. Or they may say, mentor me. I don't know anything about race and ethnicity. Could you read my proposal and give me? So you don't do these types of things. You just don't do these types of things. So I think mentoring is an important connection. And I don't want to say that all these pieces of mentoring are not important, sponsorship, life coach. But I always feel when we start to break it down like that, we start to take away something from what is really needed among URMs, which is a connection and a feeling of safety and a feeling of belonging has to be nurtured in that little relationship. So to this young woman, I just want to say it is work, and you have to know who you're talking to, and you have to know a little bit about the background and the life experiences and what they don't have. And then work with that in a caring and compassionate way.
Excellent, thank you. I just want to let everybody know that we only have 1 minute left, and then we'll have a 15-minute break, and then we'll go to another platform, which I guarantee will be better than this platform. And then we'll have a follow-up with these questions. So I apologize for the technical challenges that we're having, but this conversation is great and will get even better. So please join us in 15 minutes for the continuation of this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us for the first part, and we'll see you in the next space.
Thank you so much. Okay, so